you go to a job interview and they ask you, tell me about yourself. This is the most common job interview question. Okay, the number one most common job interview question of all time. Tell me about yourself. And also, coincidentally, for some reason, this is the question that a lot of people are the most confused about, like how to answer. It might have something to do with the fact that it's probably the most general question known to man. You could not ask a more general question than this, because you could literally say almost anything, as a legitimate answer to it, right? Like, tell me about yourself. Well, if you asked that to me, I could tell you about my food dislikes. I could tell you about my blood chemistry. I could tell you about my hobbies. I could tell you about my family. I could tell you about my passions, and my ambitions. I could tell you about my work history. I could tell you about all the people I know. I could tell you about the thing that I just did this morning and how my day's going. Like, literally, all of those would be technical answers to the question, tell me about yourself. But obviously, not all of those would be appropriate things to say in the context of a job interview. So it's all based on the context. It's based on what these people are looking for and reading the situation and all this kind of thing. So that's why I think this has people the most confused. The other thing is that it's usually the icebreaker question. It's usually the first thing they say once your interview starts. So there's no context, there's no previous discussion. It's like, hello, have a seat. That's kind of the only thing that comes before it. And then they launch into this. So a lot of people are confused, like, what are we talking about? What are we doing here, right? So I'm going to start, I think, by giving you guys what I consider to be the best answer to this question. And then we're going to unpack the answer, and then we're going to unpack what's going on with this question, okay? Okay, so this is the answer I recommend. When you get asked, tell me about yourself, the first thing you say is a phrase, okay? And this is a memory jog for you. It also frames what you're about to say. And the phrase is, well, as you can see from my resume. Okay, that's the phrase. Now, we're going to get into this phrase a bit later, but let me just give you the answer. So the first thing you say is, well, as you can see from my resume. Then you go through your resume, you give a 45-second to 1 minute summary of your resume. Okay, like preferably 45 seconds rather than a minute. Very brief summary. You start with your education, and then you describe your experience, starting from the first thing you did and ending with the most recent thing you did. Okay? So, for example, you say, well, as you can see from my resume, I have a degree in this, or I have this education, and I started out in this position, moved to this, and my most recent thing is this, which I'm currently employed in that, or something like that, right? Okay. And then you end with, because you're coming up to the present, you describe the most recent thing, you end with another phrase. And the other phrase is, and that's what brings me here today, and why I'm excited to learn more about this opportunity. Okay, so let's start by unpacking that answer, and let's get into all the things that are going on with this question. Okay, first of all, I want to say this. The phrase that you start with, which was, well, as you can see from my resume, first of all, this phrase is technically optional. Okay, some people don't like to say that. That's fine. You don't have to. It's more of a memory jog for you than it is an answer for them. So like when you hear this question, you start by saying, well, as you can see from my resume, and that frames what you then say next. Give a summary of your resume in 45 seconds. So very, very general. And then end with the phrase, and that's what brings me here today and why I'm excited to learn about this opportunity. The first phrase is optional. If you do say it, it does matter how you say it. You don't want to say it in an arrogant way, like, you should know this already. As you can see from my resume, you need to make sure that you're not communicating those vibes, right? So you would say it like, well, as you can see from my resume, I have a degree in this, right? So that's kind of non-threatening, the way you would say it, right? And it's appropriate and professional. Now, let's explain the last phrase. The last phrase you should say, the last phrase was, and that's what brings me here today and why I'm excited to learn more about this opportunity. The reason why you're saying that is because you're trying to turn the discussion to this job, That's what you're here to discuss. You're not interested in rehashing something on your resume that you did 20 years ago that is totally irrelevant. It has nothing to do with this job. It has nothing to do with who you are. You know what I mean? That's not what you want to spend your time talking about in an interview. Okay, so what you're trying to do is you're trying to end with, let's talk about this job. That's why I'm here. This is why you guys are here. Let's start talking about this role, what it involves, how I can contribute to it. And that's where you want to steer the discussion, right? Okay, so that's why you end with that phrase. And it makes sense because you covered your work history, very generally, in a chronological way. You started out this, you did that, and now I'm here, right? So let's talk about where this can go. Some other elements here. Why would you give this answer? Why would you start out saying this as opposed to some of the other answers I've heard about out there, which are, oh, when we ask this question, we want you to tell us about your personality. We want you to tell us about who you are, like as a person, your hobbies, your tastes, your pastimes, your preferences, like this kind of thing. I've heard so many conflicting recommendations of how to answer this. Here's the deal. I've observed a lot of job interviews and I've observed a lot of interviewers, whether they're recruiters or hiring managers, they all conduct interviews. And one thing is certain, and that is that interviewers are not all the same, and they're not all pushing to reveal the same things in an interview. They don't all have the same motives for asking different things. And this question, tell me about yourself. First of all, it's a cliche. So if someone literally said this, first of all, I don't consider them to be a tremendously good interviewer. It's like starting a conversation with, so how's the weather today? Or something like that. It's like, it's very cliched, So it's not exactly a sign of a conversational genius, when you start off by saying, nice weather we're having for this time of year, don't you think? This is the job interview equivalent of that, right? The other thing is that, you see, this question is an icebreaker, okay? That's meant to get the conversation started. And the idea is that, like, let's start the conversation. We have to have a starting point somewhere. And it makes sense to have a very sort of easy, general starting point. Okay, people can give an overview of things, and then the interviewer can branch out from there into a specific area that they're wanting to talk about. Okay, that's the strategic purpose of an icebreaker. It's meant to be a very easy thing to start with, so that you can then move on to what you really want to talk about, which is much more in depth, right? So all these assertions that, you need to start with something very specific, very in depth. I generally disagree with that. I mean, based on my observations, people don't start the discussion by wanting to go really deep into a very specific thing you've done. And if they do want to do that, they will ask a very specific question about that. They won't ask a very general question and then expect an extremely specific answer, right? There are some people that claim that that's what they're trying to do. They say, well, when I ask, tell me about yourself, you better be talking to me about your ambitions. It's like, well, the obvious answer to that is, well, if that is seriously what you're trying to get at, then maybe you need to ask specifically about the candidate's ambitions if you're expecting them to talk about their ambitions, right? Not everybody is a mind reader, and that's complicated by the fact that the candidate has just met you. They don't know who you are. They don't know what you're probing for unless you indicate that, right? So you can dismiss all recommendations that say, when an interviewer asks, tell me about yourself, they're looking for something very specific. You need to talk about your personality, or you need to talk about your ambition, or you need to talk about, your principles or your ethics or your vision of how a job or a business should be run. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can dismiss all of those. Those are idiotic. If there are people out there that are seriously thinking like that, they have very specific wants for how you should answer this question, they're very bad at interviewing. You know what I mean? They're not going to be successful. Okay. So you can dismiss those. This is an icebreaker question, and it's the most general question known to men. Now, what's your purpose in a job interview? Your purpose in an interview is to communicate to them how you're qualified for the role, how you have everything that they're looking for. Okay, that's what your job is. If you sit in a job interview, whether it's a virtual interview or a real interview, and you talk about something like that has nothing to do with the job in question, like in any way, it's a waste of time. You are wasting your time. You may only have a few minutes to speak freely in a job interview, if that. You do not want to spend that time talking about something irrelevant, that's something that doesn't directly speak to what they're looking for, right? So you need to find out what they're looking for and speak about it, right? Now, the question then becomes, what are they looking for? Well, here's the deal. Some of the things that they're looking for, they've disclosed on the job posting. So they've said in a section called requirements, right? We're looking for somebody who has this education, these skills, this experience, maybe these traits, like they have a certain personality type or, whatever, or certain soft skills, right? They may have explicitly said, we're looking for these things. So if you go down to a job interview and you start mentioning that, like, oh, well, I have this education and I have this experience and I have these skills and I have this trait, and, you're speaking to the things that they're interested in because they've said, we're looking for that, right? So that's part of what they're looking for. That's the disclosed criteria that they've said they're looking for. There's also other things that they're looking for too that they don't disclose, right? And that's intentional. They don't want you to know that they're looking for this. Because if every candidate knew that they were looking for that, every candidate would say, oh, I've got that. Oh, I totally have that. Yeah. Right? They're hoping that you don't realize they're looking for that. So if you mention it, they go, that must be genuine that this person has that. So that's the idea. They intentionally hold things back, right? So now some of those things, we can make educated guesses and say they're probably looking for that. For example, what are some soft skills that are good and that usually everybody values, but they don't always say, I'm looking for this? Things like punctuality, things like professionalism, things like diplomatic skills. If you have to deliver bad news or say you disagree with something, you do it in such a way that, you don't offend everybody, you don't insult everybody. You're very professional in the way you deliver that, so they understand what you're saying, but also they don't get their back up. It's professional, it's appropriate, right? That's obviously a good trait. Being able to collaborate with lots of people, lots of different types of people. That's usually a universally regarded good trait, right? Do they always write that on the job description, saying we're looking for that specifically? No, but they're still looking for it. If you don't have that, then it will be a problem, right? They may eliminate you over the fact that you don't have that, even though they didn't explicitly state it, right? So there's certain soft skills that we can make educated guesses on and say that, okay, they're probably looking for that, right? In which case, it's good that you communicate that you have that, right? Yeah, somebody's saying means the short general summary of the resume and goals. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. See, that's an assumption. If you ask a lot of recruiters, you don't have to take my word for this. Go in online and go and look up articles on how different recruiters recommend you tell me about yourself. They say anything but that. They say the opposite. They say, no, we want this very specific thing, which is asinine, because if you want a very specific answer to a very general question, then you're a moron. You don't understand how to ask a question or conduct an interview. But what about goals? You said goals. Why goals? Incorrect. Where did that come from? Now, the thing about this stuff is that everything happens some of the time. So there are interviewers out there that expect you to be a mind reader. And when they ask you a very general question, like, tell me about yourself, they're expecting you to talk about a very specific thing, like, what are your goals? Even though they haven't said, what are your goals in any way, shape, or form. They're just expecting that, right? They're not expecting you to talk about your food dislikes. You're expected to talk about your goals. But that's far from certain. Most interviewers don't expect your goals specifically, right? That's the problem with this question. So anyway, so your purpose in the job interview is to speak to what they're looking for, the explicitly stated job requirements, the things that we can make educated guesses on that they're probably looking for, but they haven't stated explicitly, right? A lot of those are soft skills, right? For example, you interview with a hiring manager and you notice that the hiring manager is an accountant. Let's say they're, I don't know, the manager of a store, and you're interviewing for being an employee in the store, right? You happen to notice that the store manager who's interviewing you, they have a background in accounting. Maybe that hiring manager thinks it's a really good thing for all the store employees to have a very elementary, basic understanding of accounting principles. Accounting is to do with costs and how you manage costs. Maybe because they come from an accounting background, they think in terms of accounting. They regard everything as a cost. That's just how they view the world and their business. Maybe they also are looking for a candidate that, as an added bonus, understands accounting principles. And they think, yeah, I like the cut of your jib. You have some very valuable skills there, right? So there might be a lot of other unstated skills, okay? Now, so the point is, some of these we know, and some of them we don't, right? I'll give you another example, and this is where it gets interesting. Let's say that the hiring manager, for whatever reason, they're looking for extroverts, okay? They place value on someone being an extrovert, even though the role they're hiring for, it's not an automatic thing that the person in that role would have to be an extrovert if they want to be able to do that job properly. You know what I'm saying? An introvert could do it, an extrovert could do it. It really doesn't matter. But because the hiring manager happens to be an extrovert, they place more value on candidates who show extroverted traits. Okay? Tell me if you've encountered that before. Right? So let's pretend that the first thing they ask you in the interview is, tell me about yourself. And you volunteer the fact that you're an introvert, and you list a lot of strengths of being an introvert, right? And you, of course, think that this is helping you. You're proud of this. You're saying, look at what I can do. And a lot of this derives from the fact that I'm an introvert. Look at the skills I have. Look at the abilities I have. You could use those, right? Meanwhile, what you don't realize is you've just eliminated yourself. See, what the manager didn't disclose in the job description was that they were also probably looking for someone with extroverted traits, because they have a belief that those traits will, be necessary for the role. This is the problem with this question. When it's a very general question and you sort of start giving them new information, things they don't know, things that weren't in your job application, things about your goals or your personality or your ambitions or your work style or your communication style, or, things that you think, okay, this is relevant to the role and I consider it a strength, so I'm going to say it. Meanwhile, you've just hung yourself. You've just eliminated yourself by saying this, because unbeknownst to you, they were looking for the exact opposite. And that's because they happen to be an extrovert, but you don't know them, right? So this is the problem with this question. How do we handle that? We handle that by giving the answer that I recommend. It's not original to me, but it's a very good answer. You start the question off by basically summarizing your resume and using that as a jumping off point to wherever they want to go, right? But you don't reveal new information about you that they don't know, that wasn't in your application. Because the moment you start giving them new information, you can get eliminated because of that. You don't know who you're talking to yet. How do you know that the stuff on your resume is good? Because you sent in your resume, and based on your resume, they called you in for an interview. So assuming that they did in fact read your resume, it shows that nothing on your resume gets you eliminated, right? It's safe content to use. So when you don't really know specifically what they're looking for, what they're asking about, it's great to sort of, as a default, go back to your resume and use some of that material. Okay, so that's one thing that's going on here. You're starting with some safe material. The other reason for doing this, by the way, is that this is something that you don't hear a lot of online when recruiters tell candidates this is how you should answer a recruiter, right? Is that in a lot of job interviews that I've witnessed, okay, and you may have witnessed this too, what usually happens in practice is that the interviewer, they don't come to the interview having done their homework on you. They haven't read your resume recently. So maybe you applied for the job a few weeks back, and maybe at that time they read your resume and then they shortlisted you for coming in for an interview, right? But between that time and this time, they haven't actually boned up on like who you are before you arrive for the interview, or if it's a virtual interview before you go live. They haven't actually revised your resume and like refreshed themselves and just given it a once over and said, okay, who is this person? They haven't done that. So it's also helpful to them if you start the interview with saying, just as a reminder, this is who I am. This is, my education, my experience, right? It's also useful for them because in more than 50% of interviews, the interviewer doesn't know who you are by the time the interview starts. They haven't loaded that information back into their head, right? So the argument that, oh, well, I already know your resume. I already have you already have it. But the odds are, in fact, that you haven't actually revised it recently. So you don't know who I am by the time the interview starts. You might even know my name, and maybe that's it. But you've got a resume in front of you that you haven't read. Well, here, let me just give you the Cliff's Notes as a starting point, right? So I've heard that answer. I've heard it said like, well, don't say your resume because their interviewer already knows your resume. Yeah, in theory they do. They should know your resume. In practice, most of the time they don't. So I take exception with that counter argument.